is Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Tonight, rejected. With just days left before a Friday deadline, Democrats shoot down the White House's DHS funding plan, but insist a shutdown is not inevitable.
There's no reason we can't get this done by Thursday. We have sent them legislative language.
The standoff comes as ICE and Border Patrol officials face intense scrutiny on Capitol Hill, forcefully defending the administration's mass deportation push in a heated hearing that's raising the stakes in this shutdown fight.
And Secretary on the Hill, also on Capitol Hill today, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick telling senators he barely had anything to do with Jeffrey Epstein, as newly released files raise fresh questions about ties between the two. The White House is standing by Lutnick, but several Democrats and at least one Republican are calling for his resignation. Plus, the costly Don Roe doctrine, why President Trump's focus on the Western Hemisphere could be a major win for China's Xi Jinping. The latest Big Take explores the cost of the U.S.'s foreign policy. Bloomberg Economics' Jenny Welch and Chris Kennedy join us later this hour.
And the search for Nancy Guthrie, the FBI releasing what it calls previously inaccessible footage in its ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today co-host Savannah Guthrie. Now the White House is stepping in.
But we begin tonight with the funding fight on Capitol Hill as the clock ticks down to a Friday deadline to avert a partial government shutdown that would see the Department of Homeland Security and agencies like TSA and FEMA shuttered. The impasse coming as congressional Democrats reject the White House's counteroffer to their demands for ICE reforms after the deadly events in Minneapolis. Those events were the focal point of a contentious House hearing today with testimony from the heads of ICE and CBP.
Director Lyons, last year you said in Phoenix at the Border Security Expo that you wanted to see a deportation process that was like, quote, Amazon Prime, but with human beings. Mr. Lyons, how many times has Amazon Prime shot a mom 3 times in the face?
None, sir, but you're also...
It's the square root of 0, that's right.
Is it safer for your agents and also the illegal alien criminal if your officers are able to go into a jail instead of having to go out and find them on the street? Mr. Lyons, I'll start with you.
Yes, sir, it would be. You wouldn't see the amount of law enforcement officers involved in immigration operations.
Right. How about you, Mr. Scott?
I 100% agree with the director.
Take off the masks, wear badge numbers, enforce discipline with real standards of conduct. But accountability starts at the top. Kristi Noem is completely unfit and should be removed from office.
With us for more on the procedural fight over DHS funding, Bloomberg's Erik Wasson is joining us from Capitol Hill. So, Erik, we know that the Democrats had 10 proposals, reforms they would like to see. The White House apparently countered, though we don't know what specifically was in that counter. We know that Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader, has called that woefully inadequate. So where do we stand?
I would say the most likely scenario is a shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security after Friday the 13th, I would note. Most activities will continue. ICE and CBP activities will continue. They're fully funded by the Trump tax bill. TSA agents, FEMA disaster workers will continue to work because they're essential, but they would be unpaid until the shutdown ends. And we would eventually see the kind of airport delays we've seen in past shutdowns. This is a very limited shutdown. Congress is set to go on recess the following week, so it could last a while. Basically, the conclusion is that moderate Democrats in the Senate that we've talked to said they will not vote for a CR until their demands are met. And the White House proposal, which is still under wraps, has been met with derision by Democrats. We're trying to find out exactly what the White House has said they would do. They've indicated they're open to body cameras and some of the demands, but they're really not open to the idea of requiring judicial warrants, saying that administrative warrants, are sufficient to go out and grab people on the street. So there's a really tough negotiation. John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, there's no time to get this done. He's going to try to put a stopgap bill on the Senate floor by the end of the week, but we expect that would fail, barring some kind of last-minute deal, which could happen, but is unlikely.
Really interesting. Erik Wasson, thank you so much. Live from Capitol Hill as we turn back to the Combative Homeland Security Committee hearing that at one point saw a moment of silence for Alex Preddy just before ICE Acting Director Lyons defended internal documents regarding ICE detainees. Listen.
I ask that the committee observe a moment of silence in honor of Alex Preddy.
All right. That moment of silence as called for by Benny Thompson there with the images of Good and Preddy behind him. Joining us now for more, someone who was on the Hill covering that hearing for us today. Bloomberg's Myles Miller. It's great to have you in Washington, Myles. I'm sorry it's for this conversation, but I'm just curious when we consider the point of oversight here, what this hearing might lead to.
Yeah, I think what was clear is that they're looking for a modicum of just what you said, oversight of these agencies, CBP and ICE. What you had in Minnesota was an operation led by an at-large commander of Border Patrol and not led by Rodney Scott, not led by Todd Lyons, but really being led out of the White House. And you had folks on both sides of the aisle. Mike McCall, former chairman of Foreign Affairs, former chairman of this committee, saying, whoa, what I saw there had gotten out of hand. It's a good thing that Tom Homan was sent in to get this all together.
Well, so when we consider what ICE operations could look like going forward, knowing the demands Democrats have made, not all of which are receiving warm welcome from Republicans, including the idea of masking these officers, what is the difference for employees of DHS when we know that police are, for example, unmasked? What is the argument that is being made that we heard from these individuals today?
The thing that they kept going back to was officer protection and officer safety. The Democrats want these agents to be unmasked because they pointed to, in several instances, masked agents spraying pepper spray, driving down the street, threatening protesters. But Republicans say, well, these officers are fearing for their safety, and so they have to be masked up, that when they go into these situations, they've been hit, they've been attacked. And so how do they come to a compromise on this, right? They said, yes, some officers are equipped with body cameras. We can improve on that. But with the mask issue not likely to go away, is there a compromise? Can they do badge numbers? Because names, you think, are going to be a non-starter because that leads to the doxing, they say.
Yeah, and Todd Lyons, I believe, said an 8,000% increase in death threats for individuals associated with ICE. Pretty incredible numbers. Bloomberg's Myles Miller, thank you so much. Now, as that hearing was playing out today, House leadership postponed a key vote on President Trump's economic policies. That procedural vote, which would ban challenges to Trump's global tariffs, is expected to take place later tonight, with several Republicans suggesting they will oppose the measure. And joining us now on this and more, Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman of Indiana, a member of the House Financial Services and Budget Committees. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Are you still expecting that this rule vote will be on the floor this evening? And if it is on the floor, will it pass?
Great to be with you all. Thanks for having me back again. I don't know for sure, to be honest, because there's a lot of moving parts right now, a lot of conversations. Obviously, this is an important vote, and there's a couple of members that just aren't comfortable with the language regarding tariffs. So it's going to be kind of a last-minute decision. I wouldn't be surprised.
But to be clear, Congressman, are you comfortable with the language?
I am. And I really think that it's important that President Trump or the president has the flexibility with tariffs, whether it's Republican or Democrat. I think we've seen a new sort of using the tariff tool differently than what oftentimes we think of with tariffs. If you're using tariffs to negotiate with other countries, that's good. I mean, if we're going to just put tariffs in place for, in perpetuity, I think that's a whole different conversation. So I think that it's important that the president have this as a tool. And I know there's a couple of members that aren't supportive of the position right now.
Well, I'm curious your thoughts on the looming Supreme Court decision as well on the president's tariff regime, Congressman, and how these will somehow collide or complement each other. Will the Supreme Court have the final word, realizing that that is specific to IEEPA in this case, or does Congress overrule the court?
Well, great question, Joe. And I think ultimately it's going to have to be a congressional decision, either by action or inaction. I know that a lot of us, and I come from the business world, I'm a free market guy, but the way that President Trump has utilized tariffs has really reset the ability on a global stage with trade policy. And so if my hope is that the Supreme Court comes back and it says, you know what, the president does have latitude with tariffs, but then ultimately if these tariffs are going to stay in place in perpetuity, that Congress has to act. But for short-term interim sort of situations, the president should have this tool. But, it's also not just a tool as far as trade policy goes, but it could also be used for national security measures as well. So that's where I hope they land. We'll see.
I'd like to ask you, Congressman, given your constituency, keeping ranchers in mind here, about another element of the president's trade policy as of late, expanding Argentine beef imports. Sir, do you support that policy?
Well, first of all, and we've talked to the White House about this, is that let's support American ranchers and farmers. It's been a tough go for American producers over the last several years. The herd size is the smallest that it's been in America since the 70s. We're seeing some real challenges here from a variety of factors, just economic factors that make it tough for the American producer to compete with overseas production. So I know what the president's trying to get to. He wants to make sure that the price of beef is affordable and it's not, too much for the American consumer to purchase at the counter. But at the same time, my goal is let's do this simultaneously. Let's support the American producer, even if we have to in the short term, bring in more supply from other countries. But at the end of the day, we've got to be looking out for the American producer because we do produce the best beef on earth.
The conversation around affordability, Congressman, has been blotted out by any number of stories, from tariffs to the Jeffrey Epstein files. And we didn't call you to talk about this for the program today, but because it happened, I'm curious your thoughts on the testimony from the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. President Trump is expressing his full support for Lutnick after the hearing today, in which he made clear that he was responsible for no wrongdoing. He says he had no relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Even if that's true, do you worry about the message that Republicans are trying to send, being distracted by all of this?
Well, obviously, I think, the Democrat Party, continues to make accusations, to try to imply that somehow President Trump or Secretary Lutnick have done something wrong. And I'm sure that those conversations have been had. And of course, if
it's
there's
a Republican-led
that
Department of Justice, though, isn't it?
Correct. No, that's right. And I think that's what shows, again, that the Department of Justice is going to be sure that every person that could be a suspect is investigated and asked, questions of. And I would support. I don't think that any person should be immune from the Epstein questions. But I do think at the same time we've gone a long period of time here. The Epstein files were already in place during the Biden administration. I am sure that if there would have been an opportunity to embarrass anyone on the Republican side, they would have done that. But my focus has been on getting this economy growing again, making sure that people have the opportunity to support their family. I know the Epstein question is about trust, and I totally understand that. But I think that at some point, there's a lot of other issues that we do have to focus on that affect the families back home in Northeast Indiana on a daily basis, making sure that they can, provide for their family, get the food on the table, make sure the kids have the clothes that they need. The Epstein question, I understand why it's there, but again, I think that it's blown out of proportion in many ways when we need to be focusing on the economy.
Well, and on one element of the economy, housing specifically, you, of course, were one of the members who introduced the Streamlining Rural Housing Act. It passed the House yesterday, 390 to 9. We don't often see vote counts like that in this political climate. Congressman, as we consider, though, the supply element of the housing market against demand, knowing that President Trump is hoping to see Kevin Warsh nominated or confirmed as the next chair of the Federal Reserve, do you expect Kevin Warsh to also play a role, or the Fed under him to play a role in addressing America's housing problem?
I hope so. And again, I would say, again, this is an issue that's more important, to more families across the country than what the Epstein files would affect them. Again, I understand the question, but let's go back to the housing issue. That's really affecting Americans right now, because let's say that you're wanting to make a transition from one home to another, and many have a very low interest rate, maybe 2-3%, and now all of a sudden interest rates have skyrocketed. They're coming down a little bit now under the Trump administration. inflation, but you were looking at 7, 8, 9% home mortgage interest rates. And so this is going to be a big issue, I believe, in the next election, just letting people have more money in their pocket and also making sure that it's easier to build a home. That's why we passed the Streamline Housing Act, to make sure that the agencies here in Washington aren't standing in the way of progress for the American family.
Well, let's keep talking through this election, Congressman. Republican Marlin Stutzman of Indiana, we thank you for joining us, as always, on Bloomberg. The stock rally took a bit of a breather today as investors digested a flat reading on retail sales and geared up for some critical economic data in the days ahead. Jobs tomorrow, consumer inflation on tap Friday. Don't ask, it's because of the shutdown. Add another dose of earnings from the likes of Ford in the case of today after the bell, and we put it all together in Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Nora?
Well, Joe, we hit yet another all-time high on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So we did see that index rising higher just a smidge, up about 0.1% higher. But those other major indexes like the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq 100 both ending lower. The S&P 500 down by about 0.3%, while the Nasdaq 100 fell by about 0.6% lower. But as you mentioned, we did get some economic data to parse through. We did see that retail sales data did stall in December. This really showing that despite the holiday season, we weren't seeing as much spending as it relates to sales during the holiday season. We've been talking so much about that K-shaped economy that we spoke about a lot at the end of 2025. Economists are saying that they expect tax refunds to underpin demand early this year. And as you also called out, we're going to be getting some CPI data and jobs data this week. So more for investors to take an eye and a look at. But speaking of the U.S. consumer, keeping our eye there, we did get some data, consumer credit jumping the most in a year. So this was a pickup in revolving and non-revolving credit. We did see that total credit rose by $24 billion there, Joe. And we got a lot of earnings out of the closing bell. But looking at two in particular, Ford, we're seeing that higher in the post-market trade. We're seeing that after the automaker said that it sees profit jumping this year after being hit by a surprise $900 million tariff bill at the end of 2025. And separately, we do see Robinhood shares tumbling lower by about 7% in the post-market trade. This is after fourth quarter net revenue fell short of expectations. And this is really all due to that sharp decline that we saw in Bitcoin and other related cryptocurrencies at the end of 2025. All of this weighing on results.
All right, Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, thank you so much. Much more still coming up, including the fight the president is now waging over a bridge between the U.S. and Canada. But just ahead, more on Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's testimony today on his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Millions and millions of documents. There may be 10 emails connecting me with him. I barely had anything to do with that person. I literally met him 3 times over 14 years with widespread in between. I have done absolutely nothing wrong. I have nothing to hide, absolutely nothing.
Welcome back to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Glines, and that was a combative Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick before the Senate Commerce Committee today, denying any wrongdoing in his dealings with Jeffrey Epstein. Calls for Lutnick's resignation growing louder from Democrats and Republican Congressman Thomas Massie. But the White House says the president fully supports the secretary. And joining us now for more is Jessica Roth, professor at Cardoza Law School and former federal prosecutor for the Southern District of New York. Good to see you, Jessica, as we consider association versus actual accusations of wrongdoing. How should we be considering the difference here with the many names that are appearing in these files?
It is important to bear in mind the distinction between allegations of wrongdoing or allegations that somebody has misrepresented in public, the extent of their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, keeping those things separate from whether there would have been proof to charge somebody and convict somebody, which requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt of every element of a crime. And so although it may be that Mr. Lutnick and others have not been fully truthful in their representations about their relationship with Mr. Epstein and other matters, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is evidence, or there was evidence at one time, to charge them with any federal crime.
Do you worry then what it means from a legal perspective when you've got lawmakers now publicly naming names on the floor of the House without any accompanying evidence?
This is one of the concerns that is raised by the dump of information that is required by the Epstein Transparency Act. Usually prosecutors do not release raw information into the public domain. They charge cases when they think they have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. What concerns me, though, I think foremost at this point, is the fact that we don't really have transparency into what the Department of Justice is doing in terms of its compliance with the Epstein Transparency Act, nor do we have transparency into the reasons why people were not charged in the past. And so although it is important to bear in mind the distinction between allegations or suggestions of wrongdoing and proof of a crime, it's hard to have confidence at this point that the Department of Justice is being fully forthright about complying with the Epstein Transparency Act, which requires, among other things, explanations of why information is being redacted, which has generally not been provided by the Department of Justice, nor do we have transparency into the reasons why people were not charged who are at least considered as possible co-conspirators when the Department of Justice was actively investigating this matter.
Well, so should we be ruling out charges in the future then, Jessica?
It's hard to say that without actually seeing what's in the documents and in the memoranda that goes through the analysis about why people who were considered as possible targets of an investigation were not charged. So we can't make any determination without actually seeing that decision-making and seeing what the evidence was and the legal analysis to support it. That's why it's troubling that the Department of Justice, in my view, is not handling its requirement under the Act well to come forward with the explanations for what it is redacting. And it's frankly just been chaotic in the way that it has provided this information to Congress and the American people.
Well, it's been over a month. To what extent, then, does the Department of Justice deserve grace in the way it has handled the public release of these files and now more recently the lack of unredacted documents that were promised to lawmakers?
Well, one of the things that the Act requires is that after all of the information required by the Act has been provided, that has to be followed within 15 days by a report that catalogs the evidence and catalogs the redactions and the reasons for them. And so that would be an opportunity for the Department of Justice to essentially bring some order to all of these disclosures that have been coming out in dribs and drabs and essentially provide a narrative explanation for what has been withheld and why. So the department still needs to comply with that very specific requirement. And once we see that, I think we'll be able to evaluate the department's position about the extent of its compliance with the requirements of the Act.
Professor, it's great to have you back. Jessica Roth, Cardoza Law School, former federal prosecutor for the Southern District of New York. We thank you. Coming up on Balance of Power, how congressional Democrats are reacting to the fight over DHS funding and much more when we speak with Democratic Congresswoman Sydney Kamlager-Dove. Coming up next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington with much more to follow here on Balance of Power as we look ahead to a grand debate for the rest of this week when it comes to fulfilling funding for the Department of Homeland Security and Democrats' refusal specifically to not fund fully ICE and its conduct in Minneapolis across the country, of course, being the factor here. Democrats putting forward a plan that would reform ICE when it comes to mask use, badge identification, accountability, and more. But with no deal in sight, DHS, as we've told you, could be shuttered just a little over 72 hours from now. With us for more as we count down to a possible shutdown again is Democratic California Congresswoman Sidney Kamlager-Dove, who serves in both the House Foreign Affairs and Judiciary Committees. Congresswoman, it's great to have you as part of our conversation on Bloomberg TV and radio. We understand there was a response to the Democratic demands that were sent. We, of course, know that Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer were asking for demasking, identification, a certain amount of training, body cameras, among other factors here to make this 10-point list. I'm not sure exactly what came back from the administration. What we understand from a joint statement from Jeffries and Schumer is it was incomplete, insufficient, included neither details nor legislative text. Did they offer a blank piece of paper?
Well, we do know that this White House has been negotiating in bad faith with Leader Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, and we also know that the majority of the American people want to see real reforms to Department of Homeland Security and ICE. They have simply gone too far, and the American people are tired of seeing these ICE terrors on their television. I think these are common sense reforms that we are asking for. As you mentioned, don't wear a mask, have proper ID, don't bust down somebody's house without a real judicial warrant, stop the racial profiling, make sure that you are having body cameras that are on all of the time. These are practices and tactics that local law enforcement agencies have been practicing and employing for a very long time. So why shouldn't we be asking the same of Department of Homeland Security and ICE?
Well, and obviously your party, in seeking these reforms, is using funding for the Department of Homeland Security as leverage here, though we know ICE specifically received funding from the One Big Beautiful Bill. Therefore, it's FEMA and TSA that ultimately, or agencies like that will ultimately actually feel the burden of the shutdown if it indeed comes to pass beyond the Friday deadline. Congresswoman, is there not an opportunity to carve out a deal that would keep those agencies funded?
Well, that had been discussions before. It had gone to the Senate.
Would you support it?
I definitely would support keeping FEMA and TSA open, but I also support meaningful, drastic, real reforms to Department of Homeland Security and ICE. And I have to tell you, I am flying every single week. I ran into the same TSA officer who helps me, and he said, do what you have to do, Congresswoman. So they understand the assignment. They want to keep working with pay, but they also know that drastic reforms need to happen with Department of Homeland Security.
That's pretty remarkable considering they just survived an historically long government shutdown. And of course, their paychecks a couple of weeks into another shutdown would be impacted again. So what's a proper duration? We talk about a CR. Should that be 2 weeks or 2 months if there was one? Or maybe a shutdown itself? How long can Democrats hold out if you shut down FEMA and the TSA?
Well, the reality is that Republicans have the majority in both the House and the Senate, so they should be able to marshal all of the votes needed in order to keep the government open. I don't think that there's an appetite for another CR. That would just be kicking the can down the road. I think the American people are tired of that. If there is a shutdown, I certainly hope that it is short, because we know that federal workers will be working without pay. But ultimately, what it is about is transparency and accountability. And if this is the lever that we have to push to demand transparency from Kristi Noem, from Department of Homeland Security, then we're going to have to do it, because the majority of the people, the American people, are saying enough is enough.
Well, Congresswoman, as Democrats push for ICE reform, Republicans have an active effort underway on the Hill right now to push for election integrity reform, to use their words, with a few measures, the SAVE Act and the MEGA Act, which is sponsored in part by Republican Congressman Brian Stile, now up for consideration. We spoke with the chair of the Administration Committee, Congressman Stile, about this earlier today on the early edition of Balance of Power. This is what he told us about why this legislation is necessary.
I think it's common sense that we should require, for example, photo identification when an individual goes to the polls. I have to do that if you want to board an airplane, you want to open a bank account, or heck, you want to buy a six-pack of beer, you need to show photo identification. So it's common sense, it's popular. This is far from the takeover argument that some are attempting to make. It's putting in baseline standards so that all Americans have confidence our elections are being run accurately and fairly.
To his point, Congresswoman, when you see the TSA agent you often interact with while you're traveling, you show him your ID. Should the same not be required for you to vote?
Well, I do believe that this is an updated version of the poll tax, and it is, I think the Republicans played for voter suppression to happen, probably because they're seeing that the big ugly bill has been disastrous when polled with the American people. Folks are concerned about how much their onions cost, how much the rest of their groceries cost, their gas costs, et cetera. And I have to tell you, when I go to TSA, because I've already gone through additional checks, I don't always have to show my ID. When I go to buy a pack of beer, I don't always have to show my ID. So that's not really true. And there are a number of seniors who would be scrambling to find the kind of ID that would be required. Would this be the same across all states? You know, what happens if you have state laws that are competing with this? There's so many questions. And ultimately, I think this is a design to prevent folks from voting or to intimidate them when they go to the polls. And I have to tell you, Kayleigh, that the one thing that we all have, the one power that we all share, is our right to vote. It is also important to reiterate that only folks who are supposed to be here, who are citizens, are allowed to vote. So the suggestion that we have to prevent the wrong folks from voting, that's already in place. But this is a scare tactic, and we should be wanting more people to vote, not depressing the folks who are interested in voting, who now may fear that they're not able to.
Congresswoman, we've covered a lot of ground here this evening. When we talk next, will the government be open?
Yes, I'm an optimist. The government will be open.
All right, we will leave it on that optimistic note. Congresswoman Sydney Kamlager-Dove, thank you so much for joining us here on Balance of Power. Now, as we just spoke with the Congresswoman about domestic affairs, we do want to talk about foreign policy as well, as thus far in his second term, President Trump has concentrated his security agenda on the Western Hemisphere and the Middle East, central pillars of his so-called Don Roe doctrine. But as the latest Big Take explores, Asia represents a far more important center of gravity, and failing to prioritize the region could carry significant consequences for the U.S. and its allies, according to a new report from Bloomberg Economics. Bloomberg Economics' Jennifer Welch and Chris Kennedy are joining us now with more. So, Jenny, when we consider the significance of that you described, there is a price tag on it, you say, of $55 trillion. What's behind that number?
So that's essentially the opportunity cost of the U.S. losing focus on the Asia-Pacific, which we project will grow up to that central economic weight by 2035 in comparison to the Americas, which is about 11.5 trillion, and the Middle East combined with Africa, which is only about 9.5 trillion. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise. When you look at the industries of not only today but the future, many of them are centered in Asia, Taiwan, the semiconductor hub, China, the world's factory floor, Japan and South Korea, central to many key technology supply chains. And I think what all of this is spelling out is the cost of U.S. strategic distraction in devoting attention to these other theaters, when in reality, Asia is going to be the center of the global economy and in many ways, global geopolitics for years to come.
You know, Chris, the administration might say, we're planning for a summit in April. We're actually going to see Presidents Trump and Xi in the same room when he travels overseas. And I believe it's the first time a president has gone there since Donald Trump last went as president. Could this start to evolve with a bias toward China?
Well, I think if we're talking about, the spheres of influence question and whether or not we're going to start ceding the Pacific to China, I think that's going to be a much bigger question than what we've seen so far. So clearly this administration is prioritizing the Western Hemisphere more so than previous administrations. But it's also the case that the stakes, as Jenny just mentioned, in the Western Hemisphere are not as significant as in the Pacific. And so, I think we've seen in the language of the national security strategy and the national defense strategy a somewhat more dovish approach, wanting to maintain peace with China. Whether that translates into us actually ceding, strategic priorities to China, I think is a much bigger question, and we'll see more as Trump travels to China.
Well, and to what extent, knowing Taiwan is probably going to feature in conversation when Trump and Xi are back in the same room, to what extent does a lot of this center around the question of Taiwan and potential military action from China specifically?
That's a great question. I think we've seen that when they've had an opportunity to talk about this issue, we've seen the Taiwan issue has not been central to their conversation, certainly in the readouts. They both seem to want to really avoid getting into the nitty-gritty details, the questions that everybody is asking about the future of that region. I think at this stage we are currently in what seems to be a somewhat sustainable detente with China, the U.S. and China, on the issue of trade, on access to critical raw materials, et cetera. I would anticipate that we're going to be seeing out of this April meeting a continuation of that trend and avoiding any additional flashpoints that could cause a significant economic shock ahead of the midterms.
When you consider the argument around export controls that we've had with AI chips alone, it makes you wonder if that's the stabilizing force here more than the other factors we're talking about. If we agree that these two economies need each other, and if Beijing needs AI chips from NVIDIA, doesn't that help to solve the rest?
I think there's a lot of areas of interdependence. The United States also depends heavily on China for many goods, but also many important inputs like critical minerals. And we saw that last year when China shut off that flow. It's what you could call a sort of economic mutually assured destruction. If either one of them were to shut off the flow of these key inputs or key goods, it could cause massive economic damage. And that has traditionally always acted as sort of a brake on tensions escalating too far. But at the same time, there are also some real geopolitical fissure points here that, for example, China holds Taiwan as its utmost priority. If there were to be a risk there, it would be willing to endure significant economic pain in order to prevent Taiwan's permanent separation. So mad only goes so far, even the economic world.
Well, and given your point, Jenny, on how intertwined these two economies are, knowing President Trump in an interview on Fox Business that is airing out today suggested that the U.S. economy should be capable of growing 15%, at least he thinks it will, under a Federal Reserve led by Kevin Warsh. Can we see a growth rate like that? I mean, arguably in general, but especially if the U.S. doesn't shift its way of thinking around Asia and China specifically?
I think a 15% growth rate would
Even
be...
China doesn't put up numbers like that.
Not anymore, especially. Yeah, absolutely. Now, that being said, the U.S. economy has been doing really well recently, but I think there's a question, too, about long-term sustainability of growth, not just because we have a massive economy, but because what are going to be the industries of the future that are really powering that growth? It can't just be CapEx and AI if you want to be sustaining growth into the 2030s and beyond.
When we get back to the idea of hemispheric influence, the Donroe Doctrine, or whatever you want to call it here, do you buy the conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C., that President Xi is watching President Trump in the Caribbean, with Greenland, when it comes to Venezuela and so forth, and feeling emboldened when it comes to Taiwan?
He's certainly watching what's happening. I would say that it's hard to say the extent to which Xi is looking at this and adjusting his plans for a potential cross-strait operation. Yes, but certainly, I think Xi looks at the pressure campaign over Greenland and says, okay, great. We're seeing a fracture in the transatlantic relationship. We're seeing, these are economies that a couple of years ago were working to try to, come to an agreement that could advance economic security, efforts to counter some of the economic challenges that China posed, and now they are fighting over a large island in the North Atlantic. So I would say that he's obviously watching and probably adjusting his, China's adjusting their strategy to engaging with both Europe and the U.S. But I think it's hard. It would be a stretch to say that this would be necessarily accelerating some sort of operation.
Well, the stakes are obviously incredibly high here, and we're lucky to have both of you with us with your great work. Bloomberg's Jenny Welch and Chris Kennedy, we thank you. You can find the latest big take on the terminal and at Bloomberg.com. Still to come, the president threatening a major bridge infrastructure project between the U.S. and Canada and alleging the end of the Stanley Cup. Plus, the high-stakes Republican Senate primary race in Texas gets a major endorsement with just weeks to go. We'll have details and more when our political panel joins us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us. We'll have a lot more on today's top stories when we assemble our political panel next. First, the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. The FBI has released new images and video of a possible suspect in the search for Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today Show co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, who's been missing since January 31st. The footage appearing to show a masked person on Guthrie's porch, tampering with her doorbell camera in the early morning hours around her disappearance. FBI Director Kash Patel sharing on X, describing it as previously inaccessible. The case has caught national attention, of course, including that from President Donald Trump, who's called it a terrible thing and offered all federal assistance.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke with President Trump earlier today, working out the details of a bridge connecting Michigan and Ontario that the president threatened to block unless the U.S. was given compensation and half ownership. Carney explained that the Canadian government paid for the bridge in full, and the U.S. already has an ownership stake. He also emphasized that both U.S. and Canadian workers and steel were used in the construction. Carney described the talk as a positive conversation and is confident the bridge will open.
Turning Point USA is endorsing Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton in the race for the Senate seat of longtime incumbent John Cornyn. This comes as Democrats see the opportunity to flip Texas, threatening the Republican majority. Paxton and Cornyn are the top two candidates facing off in the primary election next month. President Trump has yet to endorse a candidate in this race, despite pressure from his Republican colleagues.
And joining us now on these stories and more is tonight's political panel. Republican strategist Lester Munson, principal of the international practice at BGR Group, and Democratic strategist and former senior aide to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Archie Siddiqui, are with us. As we consider, and welcome to you both, that you both are veterans of Capitol Hill, and as we come together on this Tuesday, we are staring down a very quickly approaching Friday deadline to keep the Department of Homeland Security funded. Archie, given Democrats' demands and how reluctant it seems Republicans are at this point to accept all of them, is this partial shutdown inevitable?
No, I think you saw some glimmers of hope, certainly Leader Schumer in his comments today. But I think also it's a challenge when there are actually not any actual conversations. I mean, I think the Democratic offer was a starting point. The response obviously was there were some passionate responses by the Democrats to that. But the fact that there are not more conversations, like the conversations, bipartisan conversations, have become more of the exception rather than the rule. And then I think that makes it much harder to hone in on a compromise. That said, I will say that you recall at the beginning of this whole saga, it was totally impossible to actually, take off DHS to the side, which anybody who has been watching this for a long time knew that was pretty easy. So that it all comes back to political will and the president.
I'm still deeply curious to know what was in this Republican counter proposal, described by the Democratic leaders as incomplete, insufficient, included neither details nor legislative text. Did they send smoke signals over there? And if this is where we are, is it time to start drawing up the CR?
I don't know. You described it, and I'm like, so you're saying there's a chance?
Is there?
It's only Tuesday.
Okay.
We're doing pretty good. They're talking. They're analyzing each other's positions. This is how it happens. I suspect we'll get a deal here in the last hours. I think we underestimate how important the recent compromises on appropriations were in the House, where you had massive numbers in both parties supporting these regular appropriations bills. There was some real bipartisanship that happened in our Congress just in the last month that I think was the untold story in Washington. And I think so the optimistic view is they can keep that, and that's what I have, which you can keep that momentum going into this. This is more fraught, of course, is more politically sensitive on both sides for sure. But there's a real basis for bipartisan collaboration. Both sides have made compromises on a bunch of other issues. I think it's possible.
So where do you think Republicans are willing to compromise on the ICE reforms issue specifically?
I think at the end of the day, the Republicans know that what happened in Minnesota was not good for the party. They want to move on. They are going to want to get this thing done. There's going to be some tough talk, and they know the immigration issue overall can still be good for them, but this ICE issue, particularly given recent events, they want to make it go away. They'll find a way to do that.
Democrats can't vote for anything that does not include demasking, right? Because that seems to be a non-starter for Republicans. Is that where this breaks down?
I think the mask represents quite a bit.
It does.
It represents lack of accountability, not following the rules, and a culture of intimidation. So I think it's a very difficult hill to climb. And just going back to the point about the compromises that were made on the appropriations bills, it's a very good one. But the reason we got there was Republicans, after the shutdown, finally got to the point where they realized they had to have that give and take with Democrats. And so I think that's where we need to get. And, when there's political will and if the president decides he wants a deal, we'll get there.
Well, as we consider what the president decides he wants or what he doesn't want, what he perhaps wants to go away, this ICE thing may be one of them, as Lester just mentioned. He probably would like all this talk about the Epstein files, and specifically as they pertain to members of his cabinet, to go away as well. Howard Lutnick, apparently, given the documents coming out of the Justice Department, had association with Jeffrey Epstein years after he said he had cut off any ties. The White House says, Archie, he still stands behind him. To what extent does this actually matter? Could pressure grow on a cabinet secretary like this over this issue specifically?
It absolutely could, but this is ultimately the president's decision. And I do think, though, it signifies something greater. It means that the survivors, their effort is working. Because in the past, Lutnick would have gotten away with some of his misrepresentations. And because of their efforts, now there is some form of accountability. There needs to be more accountability. I think the bigger issue for the administration is there seems to be still a little bit more of a protection over the aggression, potential violators of these young girls rather than the survivors. And so you look at some of these names that were not protected, and whereas there were a number of individuals on the island who were protected. So I think that's the bigger issue.
It's Lutnick getting a lot of attention today because of these revelations and because of the hearing that took place. But the Miami Herald was digging through files and trying to pursue the name Donald Trump. And pretty remarkable, as Lutnick suggests he did not know Epstein when apparently he was on the island or said he had cut off ties. Similar for Donald Trump, who actually held an FBI interview with the former Palm Beach police chief in which he recalls talking to Donald Trump, who said he was around Epstein once when teenagers were present. Trump got the hell out of there, according to the FBI report. That's a direct quote that I'm reading. How long is the White House going to live under this cloud?
Well, I think until all the documents are released and analyzed and we go through that could be a while.
Isn't that the first rule of crisis management, just to get it all out?
You may not know what everything is. Okay. There's what, 3 million documents or more?
Yeah.
It's impossible to know exactly what's in there. And so this thing is going to be, at least for the news media, the gift that keeps on giving. We're going to see headlines on this for months.
It sure seems like it.
Well, and a lot of those headlines, at least from Howard Lutnick, are my wife and I. Archie, is that the defense here? That it wasn't just Lutnick. His wife, his kids, his nannies, actually, everybody went to the island.
I mean, listen, he's placed in a very awkward position, so I leave that between him and his wife. But it is a very awkward position, and I think he's probably not alone. We've seen this happen to some others as well. Yeah. So again, as more and more comes out, I think we're going to have a few more surprises here.
So you invoke the wife? Is that the playbook?
Hey, who hasn't stopped their yacht to drop off, to drop by their friend's island for lunch? I think people can relate to that.
That was nannies, plural, right?
With an S, yes.
I thought that was the case. Lester Munson and Archie Siddiqui, great panel. Thank you both for the insights. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it, of course, on the terminal and online with all of the stories that we've been covering throughout the day, beginning with the return of Kaylee Lyons.
It's good to be back. Thank you for a wonderful first day back from leave. A very warm welcome here at Bloomberg to all of our team as well. And we'll see you back here tomorrow for the Wednesday edition. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.